It started with one forced plea agreement, a threat to destroy my younger brother's future, and a biological father who always sided with money. In that wood-paneled boardroom, those men in tailored suits thought they had cornered a nameless desk worker into becoming their perfect scapegoat. They were completely wrong. They had no idea the quietly smiling woman before them was a high-ranking cyber intelligence commanding officer, and I had just decided to end their arrogant empire. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Anna Rose. I am 38 years old. The air in the top-floor boardroom of Vertex Innovations was deliberately engineered to intimidate. It was a suffocating blend of expensive leather-polished mahogany and the faint metallic scent of corporate ruthlessness. The ceiling was a vast expanse of frosted glass, letting in a cold, sterile light that offered absolutely no warmth. I stood near the heavy oak doors, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I did not sit. They did not invite me to. At the far end of the impossibly long table sat my younger brother Leo. He is only 22 years old. Right now he looked like a frightened child facing an executioner. His shoulders were hunched inward as if trying to make himself invisible. His face was the color of dirty snow. His hands trembled violently in his lap. He was a summer intern. He was supposed to be learning the basic ropes of network architecture. Instead, he was being lined up for a brutal corporate slaughter. They accused him of a catastrophic error. They claimed he had recklessly bypassed security protocols during a routine maintenance check, permanently erasing a critical internal database containing months of proprietary algorithms. The damage was estimated at several $million. It was a fabricated lie. I knew it. He knew it. And the men sitting across from him certainly knew it. Directly opposite Leo lounged Julian Sterling. Julian was 25 years old. He was the son of the executive vice president of Vertex Innovations. He wore a bespoke suit that cost more money than my brother would earn in an entire year of hard work. Julian was the one who had actually crashed the system. I could see the guilt hidden in the relaxed, arrogant slump of his posture. I could read the deception in the sickening, self-satisfied smirk playing on his thin lips. He leaned back in his plush leather chair and twirled a heavy gold pen between his fingers. He was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. Next to him sat his father, a man whose sheer physical presence radiated unchecked power and a complete lack of basic morality. They were untouchable elites. They needed a convenient scapegoat to cover up a colossal mistake. A lowly, inexperienced intern was the perfect target. Marcus, the chief executive officer, sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a rigged trial. He did not look at Leo as a human being. He looked at him as a minor financial inconvenience to be swiftly swept under the rug. Marcus slid a thick, cream-colored document across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of Leo. The bold black heading read, "Voluntary resignation and admission of liability." "Sign it, Leo," Marcus said. His voice was smooth, heavily practiced, and entirely devoid of empathy. "It is the absolute best offer you will get today. You admit to the gross negligence. You waive your right to any future employment or compensation here. In exchange, Vertex Innovations will graciously decline to pursue a civil lawsuit. We will not press criminal charges for the millions of dollars in damages you caused. Take the pen. End this right now." Leo looked up at me. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to scream the truth, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of the threat. Then a voice broke the heavy silence of the boardroom. It was a voice I had known my entire life. It was a voice that had never once offered me comfort, guidance, or protection. "Listen to Marcus, boy." It was Elias Rose, our biological father. Elias was not an executive. He was a high-paid legal consultant for the corporation. He made his living hovering around the edges of true power, eagerly picking up the scraps left behind by men like the Sterlings. He sat 2 chairs down from the chief executive officer. His face was flushed with intense embarrassment, not for the horrific injustice happening to his own son, but for the minor inconvenience his son was causing his wealthy, powerful clients. Elias did not look at Leo to offer reassurance. He turned his harsh, deeply judgmental glare toward me. "Don't make things worse, Anna," Elias snapped. His tone was laced with the exact same condescending venom he had used on me since childhood. "We all know Leo is totally out of his depth. He messed up. Stop standing there glaring like an angry statue. Tell your brother to apologize and move on. He needs to sign the paper before they change their minds and ruin him completely." I looked at my father. I felt no heartbreak. The capacity to be hurt by his emotional betrayal had burned out inside me many years ago. There was only a cold, sharp, and highly analytical clarity remaining. He was perfectly willing to sacrifice his own son to keep his lucrative consulting contract. He was perfectly willing to let a pampered thief like Julian Sterling walk away with clean hands. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble or shake. The room was incredibly heavy with their collective arrogance, but my absolute silence was infinitely heavier. I saw exactly what this was. It was a cheap, poorly written theatrical play, and they assumed I was merely a helpless captive audience member. They thought I was a boring, low-level civil servant who would immediately bow down to their wealth and status. I walked forward. My footsteps were steady, rhythmic, and perfectly measured against the thick carpet. I reached the edge of the table. Julian smirked wider, clearly expecting me to pick up the gold pen and force it into my brother's trembling hand. Instead, I picked up the thick, cream-colored document. The paper felt heavy and expensive. I read the first line of the text. I did not bother reading the rest. I held it up in the air for one brief second. Then I gripped the edges firmly and pulled my hands apart in opposite directions. The sound of the thick paper tearing was startlingly loud and violent in the quiet room. I ripped it cleanly in half. Then I put the pieces together and ripped them into quarters. I let the shredded pieces flutter down onto the polished mahogany table, landing like dead white leaves right in front of the chief executive officer. Marcus gaped, his mouth dropping open. Julian stopped twirling his gold pen, his smirk vanishing instantly. Elias half stood from his leather chair, his face turning a furious, ugly shade of purple. "Anna, are you insane?" Elias hissed loudly. I ignored him completely. I looked directly into the eyes of Marcus, and then I shifted my gaze to the Sterlings. I let a highly polite, chillingly cold smile touch my lips. "We will not be signing anything today," I said smoothly. My voice was exceptionally calm and perfectly leveled, cutting through the tension like a razor. "Have a wonderful morning, gentlemen." I walked around the table and placed my right hand firmly on Leo's shoulder. The physical contact broke his paralysis. I pulled him gently but firmly to his feet. "Come on, Leo," I instructed quietly. "We are leaving." I turned my back on the room full of powerful, arrogant men. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, guiding my brother beside me. I did not look back at them. I did not need to. I already knew exactly how I was going to systematically dismantle their entire empire. The ride back to my apartment was wrapped in a suffocating, heavy silence. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the asphalt were the only sounds as we navigated the crowded city streets. I kept my eyes fixed on the traffic ahead, giving Leo the physical and mental space he desperately needed to stop shaking. His hands were gripping his knees so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. The sheer terror from the boardroom was slowly draining out of him, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. We were roughly 10 miles away from the corporate headquarters when he finally found his voice. It was fragile, barely more than a hoarse whisper. "It was not an accident, Anna." I kept my grip steady on the steering wheel. "Tell me exactly what happened, Leo. Start from the beginning." He swallowed hard, staring blankly out the passenger window. I was running a basic diagnostic on the secondary servers. It is grunt work, something they give interns to keep us busy. But the network routing was incredibly sluggish, so I checked the main access logs to see if there was a bandwidth bottleneck. That is when I saw it. He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath to steady his racing heart. Julian was logged in with his upper-level administrator credentials. He did not trip over a wire or enter a clumsy string of bad code. He purposefully isolated the primary firewall. He disabled the intrusion detection protocols manually. It took him exactly 7 minutes to shut down all the security failsafes. I saw the digital footprint. He left the back door completely wide open. I tried to freeze the system to prevent a data breach, but before my command could process, the entire database wiped itself. He triggered a massive overload to cover his tracks. Because my terminal was actively trying to interface with the core at that exact second, the system logged me as the final point of contact. I absorbed the information quietly. It made perfect sense. Julian was too arrogant to be a careful criminal, but he was cunning enough to set up a blind trap. He needed a loud disaster to hide his real activity, and he needed a naive, low-ranking intern to take the full blame for that disaster. "You did the right thing by refusing to sign," I told him softly. "You did nothing wrong." "Dad thinks I did," Leo whispered, his voice cracking with a fresh wave of misery. He looked at me like I was absolute garbage. The mention of Elias sent a familiar dull ache through my chest. But the ache was old, weathered down by decades of repetition. My father had spent his entire adult life worshiping at the altar of wealth. To Elias Rose, a person's inherent value was exclusively determined by their bank account balance and their proximity to corporate power. He viewed human relationships as simple business transactions. I remembered every single holiday dinner where he had casually dismissed my life choices. He always sneered at my career. To him, I was just a lowly government employee, a woman who wasted her potential pushing useless paperwork for a mediocre salary. He respected men like the Sterlings because they could buy and sell people like us. He was a legal advisor who lived for the gold-plated crumbs falling from the tables of billionaires. The fact that his own son was being led to the slaughter did not matter to him at all, as long as it kept his wealthy clients happy and his exorbitant consulting fees flowing. I dropped Leo off at my guest room, handed him a glass of water, and told him to sleep. He was completely exhausted and passed out almost immediately. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, my cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before I swiped the screen and lifted the device to my ear. I did not say hello. "You are an absolute fool, Anna," Elias spat through the receiver. His voice was trembling with barely contained rage. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You just declared war on a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I stopped a group of corporate bullies from coercing a terrified 22-year-old boy into a false confession," I replied evenly. "You are stubborn and incredibly ignorant," he shouted. "You live in a pathetic fantasy world. You think your boring little desk job gives you some sort of moral high ground. This is the real world, Anna. Money dictates the truth. Julian Sterling is royalty in this city. Leo is nothing. You have exactly 14 hours to fix this massive disaster. Tomorrow morning you will bring your brother back to that office. He will get down on his knees, he will sign that document, and he will beg for forgiveness. If you do not force him to do this, the Sterlings will completely destroy him. They will sue him for millions of dollars. He will never work in any industry ever again. Do you understand me? Is that your professional legal advice, Elias?" I asked, my tone dropping to a glacial chill. "Or is that the sound of a coward trying to protect his own paycheck?" "You ungrateful wretch," he snarled. "Bring him in tomorrow morning. Apologize, or you are both dead to me." I ended the call. I did not say goodbye. I set the phone down on the cold granite counter. There was a time many years ago when his harsh words would have brought hot tears to my eyes. There was a time when I desperately craved his approval. But standing in the quiet dimness of my kitchen, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, hollow detachment. The last lingering shred of familial obligation evaporated into the thin air. The lingering disappointment mutated. It hardened, solidifying into a state of ruthless, unyielding, tactical focus. I walked down the narrow hallway of my apartment and stopped in front of the last door on the right. It looked like an ordinary storage closet. I pressed my right thumb against the concealed biometric scanner hidden behind the wooden molding. A small green light flashed. The heavy reinforced steel locks disengaged with a solid, satisfying click. I stepped inside and firmly locked the door behind me. The room was perfectly soundproofed and freezing cold, chilled by a dedicated industrial ventilation system. It was bathed in the low blue glow of 6 massive high-definition monitors, arranged in a seamless curve across a heavy black desk. I sat down in the ergonomic chair and placed my hands over the custom-built keyboard. I typed in a 32-character alphanumeric passphrase. I leaned forward, allowing the retinal scanner mounted on the center screen to sweep a sharp red beam across my right eye. The screens flared to life simultaneously. The stark white logo of the Aegis Cyber Command materialized on the central display, surrounded by cascading rows of complex, multi-layered encryption codes. I was not an ordinary information technology worker. I was not a lowly desk clerk pushing papers for a meager government pension. My true identity was highly classified. I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States military, operating under the highest security clearance available to the Department of Defense. My sole directive is the identification, tracking, and absolute neutralization of high-level economic cyber espionage. Julian Sterling thought he had successfully manipulated a helpless intern. He thought he was playing a brilliant, untouchable game. He was completely unaware that he had just forcefully dragged a top-tier cyber warfare commander directly into his fragile playground. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. It was time to go to work. I bypassed the commercial internet service providers entirely. Leveraging my command clearance, I routed my connection directly through the secure military backbone. Vertex Innovations thought their internal servers were completely locked down and untraceable. But every single piece of data that travels across national fiber optic infrastructure leaves a microscopic digital shadow. I did not need a civilian warrant to look at those shadows. As a cyber intelligence officer, I was fully authorized to monitor domestic traffic for severe national security threats. Lines of green and blue hexadecimal code cascaded down my 6 monitors like a heavy digital rainstorm. My fingers flew across the custom mechanical keyboard, striking the keys with a rhythmic, unrelenting precision. It took me exactly 45 minutes to bypass their remaining security protocols and reconstruct the ghost image of their ruined database. What I found hiding beneath the digital rubble was not a simple act of vandalism or a clumsy accident. It was a highly orchestrated, multi-million-dollar act of absolute treason. Julian Sterling had not randomly triggered a system collapse. The crash was a controlled digital demolition meant to bury a massive data exfiltration. I isolated the outbound packets and analyzed the routing history. Julian had intentionally dropped the primary firewall for exactly 312 seconds. During that brief, unprotected window, he siphoned over 4 terabytes of highly classified proprietary source code. It was not just random corporate data. It was Vertex Innovations' newest aerospace navigation algorithm, a guidance system designed for next-generation unmanned aerial vehicles. It was the exact kind of technology that could shift the balance of global military power if it fell into the wrong hands. He carefully packaged the stolen data, encrypted it with a military-grade cipher, and bounced the transmission through 7 different proxy servers located across 3 separate continents to mask the final destination. But Julian needed a perfect alibi. He needed someone else holding the murder weapon when the corporate alarms finally went off. So he cloned my brother's access token. Julian perfectly timed his massive data transfer to coincide with Leo's routine diagnostic check. When the system predictably buckled under the immense strain of the illegal download, Julian triggered a total memory wipe, making it look like the intern had executed a fatal command error. I traced the final destination of the stolen packets by breaking through the proxy layers one by one. The data landed squarely on a dark server farm operated by a known foreign intelligence syndicate. Julian was not just a spoiled, arrogant rich kid trying to cover up a mistake. He was an active corporate spy selling vital domestic technology to our global adversaries for a massive payout. I reached up and flipped a heavy physical switch on my console. The screen went completely black before the Department of Defense encrypted communication protocol initiated. I requested a direct top priority uplink to the Pentagon. The connection rang for less than 10 seconds. The stern, heavily lined face of General Arthur Vance appeared on my central monitor. General Vance was a man who had dedicated 40 years of his life to defending the nation. He was a battle-hardened veteran who despised many things, but he possessed a special, burning hatred for traitors who sold out their country for a quick paycheck. He was sitting in his darkened office in Washington, wearing his full uniform. "Colonel Rose," the general's voice rumbled through my secure speakers. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast, but his eyes were sharp and completely awake. "I assume you have a very good reason for flashing a red priority signal on my private line." "I have a confirmed domestic breach, sir," I replied crisply, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "A civilian contractor known as Vertex Innovations has been compromised. The internal sabotage was executed by a senior executive. He just sold 4 terabytes of restricted aerospace navigation data to a foreign state actor." I pressed a key transmitting the entire compiled dossier over the secure connection. I watched the general's eyes track back and forth as he quickly read through the digital logs, the routing numbers, and the irrefutable evidence of Julian's treason. I also included the documentation showing how the corporate leadership was actively framing an innocent college student to cover their tracks. The temperature in General Vance's office seemed to drop 20 degrees. The muscles in his jaw tightened into a rigid, dangerous line. "They are trying to pin a federal espionage charge on your younger brother," the general stated, his voice entirely devoid of any warmth. "And they plan to extort him into a false confession tomorrow morning." "That is exactly their plan, sir. They believe they hold all the cards. They think they are intimidating a powerless family. They have no idea who they are actually dealing with." General Vance leaned forward, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. "We are not just catching one bad guy, Anna. We are going to take down their entire network. I want every single rat involved in this cover-up dragged out into the harsh light." "I need authorization for a full tactical intervention," I said. "They have issued an ultimatum. They expect my brother and me to walk into their corporate boardroom at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to beg for mercy." A grim, predatory smile briefly touched the general's face. It was the exact look of a seasoned military hunter who had just watched his prey willingly walk into a steel cage. "Authorization granted, Colonel. You will give them exactly what they asked for. You will attend that meeting. Keep them comfortable. Keep them arrogant. I am deploying a federal strike team to your location right now. By the time those men realize what is happening, they will not even have the breath left to scream." "Understood, General." The secure connection terminated, leaving my office in quiet darkness once again. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and interlaced my fingers. The trap was set. The bait was ready. The arrogant men in the penthouse boardroom thought tomorrow was going to be their ultimate, undisputed victory. They were about to face the full, unyielding wrath of the United States military. The morning sun brought no warmth, only a harsh, glaring light that cut through the city smog. At exactly 7 o'clock, a loud, aggressive knock echoed through my apartment. I opened the door to find a private legal courier standing in the hallway. He shoved a thick, legally binding envelope into my hands and walked away without uttering a single syllable. I tore open the heavy manila flap. Inside was a formal, aggressively drafted ultimatum printed on the expensive letterhead of the Vertex Innovations legal department. The terms were brutally clear. Leo had exactly 2 hours to appear in the penthouse boardroom, drop to his knees, and sign the full confession. If he failed to comply by the strict deadline, the corporation would immediately file for a civil arrest warrant. They would also launch a massive $10 million lawsuit against him, ensuring he would spend the rest of his natural life drowning in unpayable debt. Before I could even set the paper down on the kitchen counter, my cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed a restricted number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I pressed the accept button and raised the speaker to my ear. "I hope you read the morning delivery, Miss Rose." The arrogant, booming voice of Vice President Sterling echoed through the receiver. He did not sound angry. He sounded incredibly amused. He was treating the utter destruction of a young man's life like a casual morning sport. "I read it," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Good," Sterling chuckled darkly. "Then I hope you have finally realized the absolute futility of your little rebellion yesterday. People like you always think you have some sort of inherent rights. You think you can fight back. But poor, insignificant desk workers cannot change the laws of gravity. People with wealth write the rules of the game, and we own the board you are trying to play on. Bring your brother to my office. Have him crawl if he has to. If you waste any more of my time, I will crush his future so thoroughly that neither of you will ever recover." I did not offer a counter-argument. I did not scream or hurl insults. I simply disconnected the call and let the dial tone ring out into the quiet room. My silence was not a surrender. It was the deadly absolute stillness of a predator waiting in the tall grass. 10 minutes later, another frantic pounding rattled my front door. This time the visitor did not wait for an invitation. The door swung open and Elias pushed his way into my living room. My biological father looked completely unhinged. His expensive tie was crooked and a fine layer of cold sweat coated his forehead. He was terrified not for his son, but for his own lucrative position. "You have to fix this right now," Elias screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You bring him down there, and you make him apologize. Are you trying to completely destroy the honor of this family? Do you want to ruin my entire career because of your stupid, selfish pride?" I looked at the older man standing in my living room. I searched his eyes for any tiny trace of parental love, any small hint of protective instinct. There was absolutely nothing. There was only a pathetic, groveling servant terrified of angering his rich masters. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in his hysterical panic. I looked at him with an alien, freezing detachment that made him suddenly step backward. "Do not worry, Father," I said softly, the quiet tone of my voice slicing cleanly through his chaotic shouting. "Today absolutely everyone will receive exactly what they deserve." I turned my back on him while he was still standing there completely speechless. I walked down the short hallway and stepped into my master bedroom, closing the door firmly behind me. I walked over to the darkest corner of my closet and opened the heavy wooden panels. I pushed aside the row of boring, invisible civilian blouses and gray office suits I wore to maintain my cover. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a heavy garment bag. I unzipped the thick protective canvas. Inside hung a pristine, immaculately tailored military dress uniform. The dark fabric was flawless. The heavy silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel rested sharply on the shoulders. Rows of brightly colored commendation ribbons, combat medals, and tactical service stars covered the left breast, representing decades of classified high-stakes warfare. I took off my civilian clothes. I buttoned the crisp shirt. I fastened the heavy jacket. For the first time in many years, I stopped hiding in the shadows. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and stared at the commanding cyber intelligence officer looking back at me. The time for playing the helpless victim was permanently over. The elevator ride to the 40th floor took exactly 1 minute and 12 seconds. I stood perfectly still, watching the glowing red digital numbers climb higher and higher above the polished metal doors. Beside me, Leo was breathing heavily. He was terrified, but he trusted me enough to follow me back into the absolute center of the lion's den. He kept stealing nervous sideways glances at the dark military fabric, the gleaming silver oak leaves resting sharply on my shoulders, and the colorful rows of highly classified service ribbons pinned to my chest. He had never seen this side of my life. Nobody in my civilian circle had ever been granted that specific privilege. When the heavy elevator doors finally slid open, we stepped out onto the thick, noise-absorbing carpet of the executive penthouse suite. The two corporate receptionists stationed at the front desk stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, completely forgetting to ask for our identification badges or security passes. I walked straight past their immaculate marble workstations, leading my younger brother down the long, silent corridor. We reached the massive double doors of the primary boardroom. I did not bother knocking to announce our arrival. I simply reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handles, and pushed the doors wide open. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different from the suffocating engineered tension we had endured the previous day. The massive room was practically vibrating with smug, self-congratulatory triumph. At the far end of the long conference table, Vice President Sterling, Chief Executive Officer Marcus, and my father Elias were casually sipping premium coffee from delicate porcelain cups. They were leaning far back in their expensive high-backed leather chairs, laughing loudly at some private, arrogant joke. Julian Sterling was sitting near the large window, his expensive leather shoes casually propped up on the polished mahogany wood of the table. He was carelessly tossing his heavy gold pen into the air and catching it a look of supreme, untouchable confidence plastered across his face. They had fully expected a pair of broken, entirely defeated siblings to crawl into the room and surrender completely. They thought they had successfully secured their multi-million-dollar cover-up. When we walked through the doorway, the loud, booming laughter abruptly died in their throats. The sudden silence that fell over the room was absolute and incredibly heavy. Marcus was the very first person to react. His eyes darted rapidly from Leo's pale, nervous face to the dark, perfectly tailored military dress uniform I was wearing. The chief executive officer frowned deeply, his thick eyebrows pulling together in a display of sheer annoyance and severe confusion. He was a wealthy man who was entirely used to absolute compliance from his subordinates, and my highly unusual appearance was a bizarre variable his corporate brain could not instantly process. Julian slowly lowered his feet from the table, his heavy shoes hitting the carpet with a dull thud. A cruel, openly mocking smile slowly spread across his face as he looked me up and down. He completely dismissed the silver rank insignia and the glowing combat medals, choosing instead to interpret the entire situation through the severely distorted lens of his own towering ego. "Well, look at this incredible spectacle," Julian laughed loudly, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Did you get completely lost on your way to a costume party, Miss Rose? Or is this some kind of pathetic, desperate psychological tactic you found on the internet? Because wearing a stolen military uniform is a federal crime, you know. I seriously hope you brought a pen to sign the confession document instead of just bringing a ridiculous Halloween outfit." Vice President Sterling let out a short, dismissive snort of amusement, taking another slow sip of his coffee. Elias simply stared at me, his face turning a sickly pale shade of gray. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to hurl another frantic, panicked insult at me, but his voice completely failed him. He just sat there frozen in his chair. I did not answer Julian. I did not look at my father. I maintained a chilling, absolute silence that caused the comfortable temperature in the room to plummet rapidly. I walked over to the nearest empty chair, pulled it back with a sharp, deliberate movement, and firmly gestured for Leo to sit down. My brother sank into the leather seat, keeping his eyes safely fixed on the polished surface of the table. Once Leo was physically secure, I turned to face the powerful men at the other end of the room. I did not sit down. I planted my heavy boots firmly on the carpet, crossed my arms slowly over my chest, and raised my left wrist. I stared directly at the glowing digital face of my tactical watch. 30 seconds left, I muttered quietly. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly steady, and dangerously cold. 30 seconds until what? Marcus barked loudly, his face flushing with sudden, irrational anger. I have had enough of these stupid theatrical games. You have exactly 2 minutes to make that boy sign the legal document before I call building security, and have you both physically thrown out onto the street." I did not offer him a single word in reply. I simply watched the second hand tick away in perfect rhythm. 20 seconds. 10 seconds. 5. Suddenly a deep rhythmic vibration began to aggressively shake the thick glass of the 40th floor windows. It was a massive mechanical roar that easily drowned out the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning system. The dark coffee in their delicate porcelain cups began to ripple aggressively. A huge, terrifyingly dark shadow fell over the bright boardroom as a heavily armored tactical helicopter unexpectedly hovered directly outside the reinforced glass, its massive rotor blades slicing violently through the morning air. Before any of the men could even register the absolute shock of the military aircraft, the heavy doors of the boardroom were violently kicked open with an explosive, deafening crash. The heavy brass handles completely shattered against the interior drywall. A flood of heavily armed federal tactical agents poured into the room like a dark, unstoppable tide. They moved with terrifying, perfectly synchronized precision. They wore full, heavy ballistic armor, their faces entirely obscured by dark tactical visors and reinforced helmets. The bold white letters of the Federal Cyber Command were stamped clearly across their chest plates. In less than 3 seconds, the highly trained agents had completely secured the entire perimeter, locking down every single exit and drawing their weapons. "Nobody move a single muscle. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them right now." The lead tactical commander roared, his authoritative voice amplified heavily by his radio communications gear. The entire boardroom froze in a state of absolute paralyzing terror. The smug, untouchable arrogance that had filled the room just moments before was instantly and violently vaporized. Marcus threw his shaking hands high into the air, his expensive coffee cup slipping from his fingers and shattering loudly against the polished wood. Vice President Sterling let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp, pressing his back incredibly hard against his chair, as if trying to merge with the leather. Elias instinctively covered his head with both of his arms, trembling violently like a frightened animal facing a predator. Julian Sterling completely froze in place. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet chalk. His fingers went entirely numb. The heavy gold pen he had been twirling slipped effortlessly from his weak grasp, hitting the mahogany table with a sharp clink before rolling off the edge and landing silently on the thick carpet. His mouth hung wide open, but absolutely no sound came out. Then the wall of tactical agents parted in perfect unison, stepping aside to create a clear, wide path straight down the center of the room. Through the shattered doorway walked General Arthur Vance. He stepped into the chaotic boardroom with the heavy, unyielding, and incredibly measured stride of a man who commanded entire legions. The 4 bright silver stars resting on his broad shoulders caught the harsh light of the room, shining with absolute, undeniable authority. He wore his full formal dress uniform, his chest heavily adorned with decades of intense military history. He did not yell. He did not draw a weapon. He simply brought with him an overwhelming, crushing aura of pure power that instantly and permanently suffocated every single corporate elite sitting terrified at that table. The invisible trap had just slammed completely shut. General Arthur Vance did not even acknowledge the chief executive officer. Marcus took a hesitant step forward, his hands shaking violently as he tried to offer a pathetic, groveling greeting to the high-ranking military official standing in his boardroom. Vance completely ignored him. He walked straight past the trembling executive, his heavy black boots thudding against the thick carpet with rhythmic, terrifying purpose. He stopped directly in front of me, brought his boots together with a sharp crack, and raised his right hand in a crisp, flawless military salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Rose," General Vance announced, his deep voice carrying clearly across the absolute silence of the room. "The intelligence operation is fully complete according to your preliminary report." I stood perfectly straight and returned the salute with equal precision. "Thank you, General Vance." The collective gasp that sucked the air out of the room was magnificent. The entire boardroom fell into a state of dead, horrifying silence. I shifted my gaze toward the long mahogany table. Elias was staring at me. The arrogant corporate lawyer who had spent over 30 years treating me like an utter failure was completely paralyzed. All the blood rushed out of his face in a single instant, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His jaw hung slack. In that one fraction of a second, his entire worldview completely collapsed. He finally comprehended that the daughter he had endlessly mocked for having a boring civil service job was actually a top-tier military commander who held the absolute power of life and death over his wealthy corporate masters. General Vance turned his attention to the men sitting at the table. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila folder and a solid-state hard drive, and threw them both onto the polished wood. The heavy smack made Vice President Sterling jump out of his chair. "Julian Sterling!" General Vance barked, his eyes narrowing into a dangerous glare. "We are not here to discuss a tragic system failure. We are not here to negotiate a civil lawsuit. We are here to formally charge you with the theft, unauthorized duplication, and illegal distribution of highly classified national aerospace technology." Julian panicked completely. The smug, untouchable smirk he had worn just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. He threw his hands up in the air, his voice cracking loudly. "This is insane," Julian screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at Leo. "It is a lie. It is a complete setup. I did not do anything. The intern crashed the system. Check the access logs." I did not argue with his pathetic lies. I calmly walked over to the multimedia console built into the side of the boardroom wall. I pulled a highly encrypted military-grade decryption drive from my pocket and plugged it directly into the port. I routed my display to the massive presentation screen hanging at the end of the room. Instantly, a detailed map of global proxy servers illuminated the dark room, followed immediately by an undeniable digital transaction receipt. It showed a confirmed transfer of exactly $5 million routed directly from a known foreign intelligence syndicate into a hidden offshore bank account registered in Julian's name. I followed it up by playing a crystal-clear audio recording of Julian negotiating the final data drop over a supposedly secure line. "Your digital footprint was incredibly sloppy, Julian," I stated coldly, looking down at him. "You left a massive trail of digital blood leading right back to your own desk." Faced with the undeniable absolute proof of his treason, Julian instantly broke down. His tough, arrogant facade completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. He collapsed back into his leather chair, weeping uncontrollably. He grabbed his father by the sleeve, sobbing and begging him to fix the situation. Vice President Sterling desperately tried to pull his usual weight. He puffed out his chest, completely ignoring the federal agents pointing rifles at him, and looked at the general. "Listen to me very carefully, General," Sterling commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and arrogance. "I know state senators. I know powerful federal judges. We can write a massive check right now to settle this ridiculous misunderstanding. Tell me exactly how much money you want." General Vance looked at the vice president with a level of absolute disgust usually reserved for insects. "You cannot buy your way out of federal treason, Sterling," Vance replied, his voice laced with pure venom. "You are officially under arrest for actively aiding and abetting an enemy of the state, and for attempting to orchestrate a massive corporate cover-up of international espionage. Take them both away." The tactical agents moved in immediately. Cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around the wrists of both Sterlings. Julian screamed for his lawyers as the heavy agents forcefully dragged him and his father out of the luxurious boardroom, completely stripping them of their money, their power, and their dignity. Marcus was left sweating profusely at the head of the table. He looked around the empty room, realizing his entire corporate empire was on the verge of total destruction. He rushed toward Leo, his voice shaking with desperate, sickeningly sweet politeness. "Leo, my absolute favorite boy," Marcus cried out, clasping his hands together in a pathetic, begging gesture. "Please accept my deepest, most sincere apologies. It was a massive misunderstanding. You simply must stay with Vertex Innovations. We will double your intern salary right now. We will give you a full-time executive position." I reached into my uniform pocket, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and dropped it right onto the table in front of him. "This is my brother's immediate resignation," I declared firmly. "He does not need your pathetic charity. As of 0800 hours this morning, Leo has been granted full security clearance and specially recruited into the Advanced Engineering Division of the Aegis Cyber Command." Marcus collapsed back into his chair, utterly and completely defeated. The tactical agents finished clearing the room. Marcus quietly gathered his things and fled the suite. Eventually, only 3 people remained in the massive boardroom: me, Leo, and Elias. Elias slowly pushed himself up from his chair. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely stand. He looked at me, tears of profound regret finally welling up in his aging eyes. He took a slow, painful step toward me. "Anna," Elias stammered, his voice breaking pathetically, "I had no idea. I am so deeply, truly sorry for everything. Please, you have to forgive me. We are family." I reached up and slowly buttoned the top collar of my military jacket. I looked at the broken, miserable man standing before me. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but pure, unadulterated indifference. "Just apologize and move on, sir," I said quietly, staring right through him. "Exactly like you always said." I turned my back on him. I placed my hand firmly on my brother's shoulder. Together, Leo and I walked proudly out of the heavy boardroom doors, leaving Elias alone in the crushing silence of his own making and leaving our toxic past behind us forever. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.